Yes, because the recording does not get started when Sue Ann is not in the house. I even look on Tuesdays, we have staff meeting and I write all my notes and I had in capital letters, don't forget to start the recording tomorrow because I knew Sue Ann wouldn't be in. And it was right there on my note. And guess what I did? I come by that forgetfulness on it. Okay, you done over there?
I'm trying to figure out how not to block their view.
Oh, sit on their lap.
Sure, come on, girl.
Oh, yeah. Good time. All right.
Okay.
Here.
Will that work? Okay.
And you see Lynn.
Yeah. Okay.
And I can move too, if necessary. All right. Well, welcome everybody. We have a great weekend coming up for us here. It's both Palm Sunday and we make it Passion Sunday. Back in the day when the church was in the middle of the village and all the shops closed at noon during Holy Week and everybody would funnel over to the church, you could have just Palm Sunday and just have palm and just wave branches and sing happy songs. But now the attendance at midweek services is about 1/5 of what you're going to have on the weekend. And so if you're going to avoid jumping from Palm Sunday celebration to Easter celebration and skipping the whole drama of the crucifixion, we have to have Palm Sunday / Passion Sunday. And so that's what we'll have this Sunday and Saturday. So I hope you're all equipped to be there. I call it Palm Sunday because it's on a Sunday that it happens in the text, not because you can only celebrate it on Sunday. Okay, let's start with a word of prayer, and then I'll ask you if you have any questions about the video or the reading. Gracious God, center us, bring us to this moment. Help us to hear the cries and the shouts. Help us to understand the passion and the pain. Give us curiosity. Give us openness, we pray. Amen. Okay, do you have any questions about the story, the reading, the video, any of those things that you would like to kick us off with here?
You know what was hard for me to think about? That when Jesus wanted the colt and went to, supposedly, I thought the man was a stranger that was the owner of the colt, and then he just gave it to him. There must have been some kind of communication with that man before, or, I mean, if I said, Pastor wants to ride a horse, so I go over to the fairgrounds where they have the horses, because he wants to ride it down to Newport Pier or something. They'd say, well, who is he?
Right.
Why does he want that? Who does he think he is that he can just take that colt or whatever?
Right.
And without knowing you, no, if they would have said, oh yeah, we know him, we've known him for your great pastor. Sure, he can, and he's ridden our horses before. That was hard for me to get through that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I mentioned in the video, I don't know if this is the best, most respectful language to use, but I think the way I was taught to think about that as a child, either directly or just assumed it, was kind of what I call the magic Jesus thing, where Jesus just knew there'd be somebody, and if he gave them these words to say, and I always think of this moment in Star Wars where the Jedi looks at the guards and says, "We must pass," and the guards are like, "Yes, you must pass." You know, it does a kind of mind trick on them. I think I've always had that in mind as a kid, and it wasn't until I read Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan's book, The Last Week, that I thought that they suggested Jesus arranged all of this ahead of time. And the same thing in the story in chapter 22, when he says, go into town, you'll see a man carrying a vessel, follow him, tell the owner of the house, this is where the master wants to have his meal. That too looks like something that was prearranged. And it makes, I don't know if I'm being skeptical, but it makes a lot more sense as a prearranged sort of thing. Jesus is orchestrating these events, yes, and had already communicated with somebody about using that colt. I suppose it's interesting in Luke, there are two owners, or there are more than one owner. It's plural. The owners of the colt ask, "Why are you taking the colt?" It's singular in some of the other gospels. Yes, Deborah.
If you're done with.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. You mentioned in the video about the parable that preceded this.
Yeah.
And I'm just not getting why Jesus would have told that parable. It is
Yeah.
the antithesis of what he said on Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, so we need to spend some time with this. As I mentioned in the video, verse 28 is a transition from what had been said before to what's happening now. Maybe it's just a new chapter, but we did have a very difficult parable that Jesus tells after the story of Zacchaeus and before the entry into Jerusalem. And that's the parable of the pounds. Now, let's be very clear that Luke tells this differently than than Matthew and Mark. But the difficulty of the parable is in all three of the synoptic gospels. Luke mixes two things. Number one is the distribution of the pounds and the demand of hearing how the servants have invested and made more money with the pound that they received. That's one part of the story. The other part of the story is that the person doing this is a king that nobody wants, and a king who's going to exact retribution at the end. Okay? So Luke is unique in that way of telling this story. The parable itself, in the middle of the pounds, is hard enough to interpret. You put it in that context, it makes it very difficult. And yes, almost the antithesis of what Jesus has been preaching and teaching. If it is the antithesis, if you assume that the person who becomes the king is a Christ figure or a God figure. Read it as if that person is Herod. Read it as if that person is a Herod figure or a Pilate figure who has gone to Rome to ascertain a kingdom, whose people don't want him as a king, and whose response to people that don't want him as a king is to slaughter them. If you read it that way, then the parable inside, the parable of the pounds itself, turns on its head. So here's how we've often heard this. I mean, first of all, Luke tells it differently. There are 10 pounds, 10 servants, each gets 1 pound each. And one of them, he only calls 3 of them to find out how they acted. One of them made 10 pounds, so he gets a reward. And the other made 5 pounds. He gets a reward. And the last one didn't invest at all, didn't do anything on behalf of this tyrant king. Instead, buried it, took it out of commission. Burying money means that you're not letting it circulate, and you could see that as a protest. I refuse to be involved in your way of doing things. And of course, the tyrant then is going to refer to him as a lazy servant. Look how he describes him. This is not a description of God, certainly not a description of Jesus. I know you are a harsh man who takes up what you didn't sow and reaps, or takes up what you didn't put down and reaps what you didn't sow. That is not at all how Jesus represented God in his preaching, teaching, and being. So I have argued many times, and unsuccessfully with some of my colleagues that this is not a parable that says, oh, when God gives us gifts, we really have to invest in it because you don't want to bury your gift because then God will be irate. Because I'm like, that's not the God I serve, not the God of this parable who exacts retribution. This is not, I cannot imagine in any of the three synoptic gospels when this story, however it appears, and especially the way Luke contextualizes it. I do not feel like this is a parable about God. This is a parable about what the people are dealing with every single day. This is what the king they have appointed over them is like. They don't like it. They don't want him. And because they don't want him, he's even harsher. And you've got this one person who I would say is the faithful hero in this story, who refuses to participate. He's probably going to die for it. But he refuses to participate in a system that enables this harsh king. Luke's way of telling the story is a little uneven and it's kind of odd, but notice the beginning, notice the end, and then the parable proper is in the middle of that. It strikes me that the context that Luke gives us is a clear signal. This is the king you have that you don't want. Okay? So then the question becomes, how does that relate to Jesus riding in on a colt with people saying that this king, this is the king we want? And so that's how I would read it. That on the one hand, you have a parable, contextualized parable about the king you don't want and how they operate. And that's why the people are celebrating and inviting a king who comes riding in on a colt. And that's why I think the colt becomes symbolic of humility rather than the conquering steed hero, riding in like Prince Ali Ababa, right? To me, that's how I circle back and read that parable. What do you think, Deborah?
No, that makes sense. I never read it as the king was God.
Yeah.
Or even Jesus. I didn't read it like that. But I just thought that, like, especially at the very end, when it's so emphatic about that those who have will have more and those who don't have anything will have even less.
Yeah, boy, doesn't that sound like the king you didn't want?
Exactly. Yeah. So I just wasn't, I couldn't figure out why Jesus was telling this parable.
Yeah.
And especially when it says he, because they were supposed that the king of God was to appear immediately, he told this parable.
Yeah.
And that was the other thing. I just couldn't make sense of the thing.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
And so for me, the harder question is, if Jesus is telling the parable because they expected the imminent institution of the kingdom of God, and why does Jesus participate in the parade where they call him the king? I can't quite connect that in my head. I don't have any trouble seeing that it's an anti-parable, as it were. If we think parables are about the reign of God, this is something of an anti-parable. It's about the reign of Herod, I think, very clearly. And I can see where the parade then becomes an anti-Herod sort of thing. But I don't know quite what to do with that part, personally. Yeah. So it's not my intention to complicate a story that we love a lot, just to make it more difficult. But I think Luke does that for us in the way these stories are told, and that transition from such a horrific parable to this moment. The other thing that's going to ruin the occasion for us. And I'm going to say this to you. I don't know if I'm going to say this out loud on Saturday and Sunday. There are no palms in this story. Did you notice that? Darn it. We have to come up close Sunday. That just doesn't have the same touch, does it? You know?
Close.
Cloak Sunday. And everybody just take off your outer garment, toss it here. Let's shake them around. So part of what we try to do in here is let each of the gospel writers have their voice. It is fine and necessary later to step back and synthesize all the gospel stories together and stuff, and you can only believe one sort of way. But Luke's story is not a Palm Sunday story. It's about cloaks. And that's interesting, isn't it? I think I've told you this before, but I'm going to say it for those of you that weren't here. I was in El Salvador one time, and I was there with a group. There was a couple that was part of the group that was there who were very active in the ministry that we had going down there. And they were celebrating their 20th anniversary while we were down there. And it happened to be the same day that we were remembering the 25th anniversary of Oscar Romero's assassination. So we could not get it out of people's heads that this couple was celebrating their 20th, not their 25th anniversary. So we just finally threw it to the wind and said, okay, look, you're going to celebrate your 25th anniversary, whether you've been married that long or not. But they wanted the community. This is a very small, about 200 people community. The house is made out of sticks and dirt floors, those kinds of things. But they wanted to throw a celebration. And it was incredible to see a genuine peasant celebration. They had some poles that were more or less like bamboo, kind of thick bamboo. They didn't have PVC pipe; they had bamboo, and they used sharp sticks to dig a hole, and then they planted these bamboo, and just pounded them until they were pretty rigid upright. And then then one guy climbed up the palm trees. We tried doing that. You get about 6 feet, then you scrape all your skin off sliding down. He just clambered up there and would hack off those long palm leaves and just drop them. And they had a way of kind of crossing those over those poles to where they just built an outdoor amphitheater for it. I mean, it was crazy. That this all took about an hour. And it was just reminding me that there is such a thing as a peasant approach to celebrating that doesn't have to rent, a shelter at a park or rent the fellowship hall at the local church. You make do with what you have, and you become incredibly resourceful. And it was probably just second nature to a lot of these folks that this is how poor people put on a parade. And you take what's at hand. Matthew and Mark will tell you it was palm branches. John as well. Palm branches, which makes a lot of sense. There's sometimes they're waving them, sometimes they're grabbing other plants, sometimes they're throwing them on the road. And you just make a procession out of it. So whenever I read the story, whoever's telling the story and whatever exactly the details are, it just reminds me that this is how peasants do celebration. And you take whatever is at hand and you use it. You may not have, armed guards, in their brass and finery and all that stuff. but you got cloaks. And you can make a parade out of it. It's pretty incredible, I think. Okay, any other questions, comments about this story? I probably just blew my whole wad right there in the
Yeah.
first 15 minutes. I don't know if I have anything else. If I have anything else to say. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know,
Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if you covered this in the video. Kurt, why the cloaks for palm leaves on the ground to begin with?
Yeah, that's a
Are
great
we-
question.
Are we going back to the temptation where Satan says the angels are gonna hold you up and your feet won't even touch the ground?
Oh, yeah. Like, are they deliberately putting a tripping hazard to see if?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It sounds to me like a tripping hazard. One thing that occurred to me is maybe they're lining the street with that just to kind of make a pathway. I don't know. It's beyond me.
Maybe the ground was wet.
Yeah, I mean that's a possibility. I grew up in Virginia where they always tell you the story about Sir Walter Raleigh throwing his gallant act of throwing his jacket on the mud so the queen won't get her toesies wet. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the ground would have been like. I don't know what the weather's like. I don't know if it's related. I don't know if it's just symbolic. I wish I could answer that.
Good enough.
I don't trust anybody who does answer it. I just like, yeah, sure. But I don't know. Carol?
Well, one more thing on the story of the towns. Because it starts with, and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately, he said, therefore, and then he tells the story.
Yeah.
Could he be wanting to slow down their expectations?
It feels
That's
like
the
it.
implication, I think.
Yeah, it feels like it.
Yeah, okay.
And if you have an immediate messianic expectation, you can fall for a lot of things. And I just don't know if that's a purpose in itself to tamper down those expectations.
Yeah, kind of a not yet.
Yeah. I don't know.
Sorry,
I mean,
just-
Jesus is going to come into town. I don't know what the townspeople are thinking when they're yelling. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven, glory in the highest heaven. I don't know if they think Jesus is just going to keep riding right up to Herod's palace and dispose of him. I don't know where they think this is going to go. The next thing that happens is Jesus is going to weep over Jerusalem because it has a habit of killing the prophets that are sent to it. My guess is that yes, Jesus is having to temper the expectation. And to me, maybe that's why he's choosing to come in on a colt rather than some other way. But I don't know. There's a lot left here just to speculate. Yes, ma'am.
One of the things they made light of here, maybe Jerry can, my recollection of the geography,
Mhm.
Jerusalem, the city on the hill, there are deep valleys, and there's a deep valley between where he is in Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives. Way down. And there's a
Wow.
cemetery there, and it's a very ancient
Mhm.
cemetery, as I recall. And then you have to come up to the city, so it's not kind of like just going right across.
Right.
Um,
Maybe that's
Yeah,
to
that's what-
establish footing or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Especially like if Joanne suggested if it's wet in any way. Yeah, I don't know. All right, anybody else?
when brides get married, they put a rug or they put a
Yeah.
cloth down.
Yeah,
It's like the red carpet or a cousin to the red carpet.
Right.
It makes it special.
right. That's a great point. Yeah. Now, I did a wedding one time that was outside at a beautiful little scenery. Outdoor weddings are a bad idea generally. I'm just going to throw it out there. And they had put the little red, like I guess it was white cloth over top of stepping stones. And it was fine till the ring bearer or the flower girl tripped and skinned her knee and screamed and, lost it. Her dad had to go get her and pick her up. And as he was carrying her off, she was throwing flowers over her shoulder. And that can really be a hazard
Yeah.
if it's not a flat road. So I just don't,
Was it an Indian?
no,
I
it
know
was
sometimes
just,
they do that.
no,
With
it was the worst wedding ever, is what it was. One of the groomsmen had torn both of his ACLs the 2 nights before playing softball of all things. And so 3 people had to carry him in his wheelchair. And it was 190 degrees. It was terrible. Anyway,
Well,
yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to do with the cloaks. Yes.
well, I know when I was running several times, a colt would not be very sure-footed.
Yeah,
That's
let's
where
think
I
about,
came
yeah,
from. And
Yeah.
I thought, especially never ridden
yeah,
before, that putting all of that down, I'm sure the roads were rocky and stony. I thought, putting the cloaks down might have been a way for him to be easier not to fall.
right. So yeah, let's just deal with a couple of things we don't quite know. Okay, one is, yes, it's a colt. Luke doesn't tell us what kind of colt, so it could be a young donkey, it could be a young horse. Anything in the equine family is the definition. I saw a young member of any of the equine family. And so, of course, immediately I had to look up what exactly constitutes the equine family. And yes, it has donkeys, asses, colts, jackass, horse, any number. So I don't know how sturdy of an animal this is. If it's a colt in the horse family, you would think the spindly leg little thing, that might be,
Shaky.
But, this could also mean, the fact that it had not been ridden means that it's unbroken one way or another. I don't know the significance of that. I'm not sure what that means. It sure seems to me that would be the last animal you want to throw a bunch of clothes in front of as it's making its way. So I just don't know. I just think we're so separated culturally and temporally from the story that I'm sure all this stuff probably has significance, and I don't trust anybody local and contemporary who feels like they know exactly what it means.
No.
You know what I
Like
mean?
the whole story wasn't there.
I'm sorry?
The whole story wasn't there.
If it was there for people at that time who knew it, who
What
knew
it
what
meant.
this was all about, and not us.
We
This
forget-
reminds us, sometimes when we read Paul's letters, we're often reminded that we're reading someone else's mail.
That's right.
And you're always a stranger to that conversation. And I think the same is true when we're reading the Gospels. Where it's almost like we're reading somebody else's story in a context that we don't know the context, right? So it just humbles us. As much as I love to kind of point out this, that, and the other thing, we have to take it all with a little bit of grain of salt because we're doing our best. We're doing our best, looking at contemporary literature, taking guesses from what we know. So that's one thing we're not sure of is what kind of animal this is. Another thing we're not sure of is what the significance of this being a young animal, unbroken, as it were. Another thing we're not sure of is why they're. It makes sense to me that they pile their clothes on top of the animal. That just sounded like a makeshift saddle to me. But we're not sure of the point, the symbolism of throwing them on the ground. I want us to be really mindful of this. The word translated Lord, Kyrios. It is properly translated Lord. It could also be properly translated Sir, Mr., and owner in this story, because the owner, if the owner, okay, so when Jesus gives the instructions, he says, if anyone asks you why you're untying the colt, tell them the Kyrios needs it. But in the actual event, it's the Kyrioi, the owner of the colt. It's the same word, owners and Lord. It is an interpretive judgment that your translators are making to decide that owners is appropriate in this moment and the word Lord is appropriate in this moment. It's a further interpretive judgment if they capitalize the word Lord, because that's how we talk about Jesus. It's the same word. And it in English, or at least in the United States, I mentioned this in the video, we use the word Lord almost exclusively for Jesus. And that is just not the case in other parts of the world and in other languages. Not the case in Greek. The word Kyrios could mean any number of noble or revered people, not just the one and only Lord Jesus Christ. Now, it can mean the one and only Lord Jesus Christ, but it's a much more common term. Even when people are using it as the one and only Lord Jesus Christ, they're using a common term. That's hard for us to wrap our heads around. Yeah. So the other thing we don't know is exactly what the people have in mind when they say, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Now, it sounds a little bit like the Christmas story in some respects. It does not mention peace on earth. They call Jesus a king. I don't know of any place where Jesus calls himself a king, but that will become an issue as we continue reading. And as Jesus is on trial, as it were, with Herod and Pilate, are you a king? You say so. Are you a king? People say you're a king. The inscription on the top of the cross, this is the King of the Jews. I don't think there's really a verb there. This, the King of the Jews. To call Jesus a king, for Jesus to claim to be a king would actually be a crucifiable offense. That's part of why the question is, are you calling yourself a king? Do I have to put you down? Pilate and Herod are not going to come to a conclusion on this. They don't see why Jesus is deserving of death. They are compelled by the crowd to put Jesus to death. Also in Luke's gospel, their common decision to throw Jesus under the bus, to make him a scapegoat, heals a rift between Herod and Pilate. Up until that time, they're not friends, and they became friends over this, because nothing makes good friends like a common scapegoat. Remember that when you get a fundraising letter in the mail. Nothing makes for good friends like a common scapegoat, because the enemy of our enemy is our friend, right? So that's, I don't know what the people have in mind when they say blessed, the king. I don't know if Jesus is going along for the ride, so to speak, and trying to redefine the word king. I just, it's an enigma of a story to me. I don't think it's wrong to call Jesus king in some respects, but I don't think it's a title that Jesus was particularly asking people to use for him. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I think the crowd might have put that name on him. They put him on a colt and he's going through town and they're all saying, "Hail, King of the Jews."
Which also would be a punishable offense if Herod, the tetrarch of the Jews at that time, has any say about it. It certainly is an offense against the authority of Rome. So this might be the people finding their voice to stand up and protest what they've been living under. And it's short-lived. It's not going to lead anywhere. The crowd will not be slaughtered. But we did just have a parable that the people who refused the king appointed by the foreign powers were slaughtered for it. So this could be a very brave act for these people to openly call Jesus king, especially after he has said those things. If that's the reality they're living with. Let's look at the little dialogue at the end of the story, because during the parade itself, Jesus really doesn't do anything. They seat him on the donkey, or the colt. The colt carries him. The people yell. Jesus, he's not given the victory sign. He's not doing anything in particular that we know of. But then we hear Jesus' voice at the end. And it's prompted by the Pharisees, some of the Pharisees. I kept emphasizing the word some, because there were many Pharisees who were happy about Jesus' ministry, and a number of them became followers. But some of the Pharisees in the crowd said, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop." And I want to know what you think of this last sentence. I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out. What do you reckon that means?
That must mean it's pretty bad, even the stones, are capable of shouting out. It emphasizes that it's not all right to be silent, right?
Yeah, it could be that one way or another, we have to cry out against the king we have and for the kingdom we want, something like that. One way or another, someone has to cry out for.
It will come out. It has to come out.
The message has to come out some way or another.
Even if it's the stones that have to.
Which might be just the deadest thing you can see at that moment,
Yes.
right? The thing most likely not ever to say anything. I mean, we've got a story of a talking donkey back in the Old Testament. So if that little foal thing had started chattering, we'd be like, okay, we've seen this before. The trees, clap their hands and so forth. We've anthropomorphized animals and trees. But it seems like a stone would be the most unlikely thing to pick up the song of praise. It might be that this song of praise is going to happen one way or another. This protest, this hope has to happen some way or another. If they don't do it, something will. Maybe something like that. Let me ask you this. Can you think of a moment Can you think of a moment when stones make noise?
And they're falling down.
Earthquake, when they're falling. I mean, they're all tragic moments, right? Have you ever been nearby? And this is not stones, but it's always surprised me when people are using an auger on the ice to go ice fishing. Have you ever heard that? It's the weirdest sound, and it just echoes because the surface of the ice is perfect for bouncing sound. And I've been told that there's kind of a similar musical quality, as it were, when rocks split, whether it's as a result of plates shifting or something like that. That there's a creaking to it. There is something. I would imagine rocks shouting is a foreboding thing. I don't know. I mean, it's not anything. I'm like you. I've never heard a rock talk. Even when we had pet rocks, they were strangely silent. Those things.
If you have a dam made out of stones and it's going to give way, there's a lot of noise that occurs on its way to disintegration. And there's a lot of noise as it falls apart and washes downstream.
Yeah.
So
I can remember growing up though and hearing that remark, if the stones could talk. And I also remember being told that's because they were here before anything else. Isn't that weird? That you hear that.
Well, that's a great way of just thinking about stones in general. Is pre-existing all the chatterers we know, right? Yeah, I've heard if walls could talk. I don't know if
There's a good book called The Stones of Venice about the history of Venice. If the stones
Interesting.
can talk.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Huh. Yes, Beryl.
I was alone in a building in Berkeley when an earthquake hit. And it was the sound, I mean, I don't know if it's stone, but it was certainly earth. It was like a train coming through. The sound was just so loud. But back to stones, that there are, I wonder about some traditions. Even now they talk about the living stones. And particularly the Christians in Palestine, I think, don't they refer to themselves sometimes as the living stones?
They might. That's from one of the letters in the New Testament.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's kind of the reverse though, that
Yeah, I don't know.
I didn't read this as foreboding. I actually, when I read that last line, I loved that last line. And what I felt about it was that the inevitability of God's reign on earth is unshakable. That the stones are even part of it. That's how I read it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's lovely language in the Psalms that it will anthropomorphize much of nature, but because nature itself praises God. And, I think that's a lovely way to think about nature rather than something animate, some inanimate. All of it, by virtue of existence, is filled with the beingness of God. Even stones, right? Which last Monday I wanted to ask our guest speaker at Great Decision whether AI is part of creation that will ultimately worship God.
Say that again.
whether AI is, insofar as artificial intelligence exists, is it now part of God's creation? Therefore, part of God's redemptive order.
Well, he's allowing it to happen.
so.
Yes. That of course is a question for another day. But the reason I say that is because it's ridiculous or odd as that question sounds. I imagine this sounds as ridiculous or odd. But if rocks are capable of crying out in the absence of human participation, I think that only makes sense if you have the kind of vision that the psalmist had, that everything that is by dint of God's creative power and is therefore reflective of God. If God is the power of being, then everything that is an expression of God's power, including rocks, something like that. Which would be a much more compelling argument if everywhere you look, everything's made out of stone. I mean, when we hear Joseph is a carpenter, he's probably a stonemason more than a woodsmith, right? Or a little bit of both anyway. This is the raw material with which they had a lot of work. Certainly don't have a plethora of trees there. So this is the stuff of life. If these people don't cry out for a new world, the stuff of life will. Something like that. I don't know. I feel like I'm spending most of our time here just complicating things.
And your point would be?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. So whether the people have the right expectation or not of Jesus being the king, he's not going to silence them. That much is clear. Whatever they're saying, the Pharisees want them to stop. I imagine because what they're saying is radical and could get them in a heap of trouble.
Yeah.
Pharisees want Jesus to make them be quiet. Jesus won't do it. Interesting.
You can't sit in trouble.
There's going to be trouble down the road here. All right, what else?
I hope it's good trouble.
Yeah. Let's look at the story that follows just very briefly, okay? This is where Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. So remember, in Mark's gospel, Jesus in chapter 8 discloses for the first time that he's going to Jerusalem, where he's going to be killed, and on the third day raised. In Mark's gospel, Jesus actually enters Jerusalem in chapter 11. You remember what happens at the end of the parade in Mark's gospel? Jesus is welcomed into Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple and looks around and then leaves. Yeah, it's like the worst climax ever to any story ever written, right? This is what happens in Luke's gospel, is as soon as this is over, as Jesus came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, if you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God. Another reference to stones. Only this is a symbol of destruction. They're going to build ramparts. They'll surround you. I imagine those ramparts are going to have trebuchets or something like that that are going to be slung and destroy them. This all happened, of course, when in the year 70, when the temple was destroyed. And all that's left is the Wailing Wall. It was a magnificent structure that people thought could never be destroyed. And sure enough, it was. So Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem. He does not make reference to the history of Jerusalem killing the prophets like Mark does, but he's weeping over Jerusalem. If they had recognized the things that make for peace. On this day, you just wonder if this is an opportunity and it doesn't go anywhere. Opportunities lost. And that seals the fate. I don't know. It's disturbing, and it's as disturbing as the story that precedes this parade. Now, this weekend, I want you to have fun during worship and shake your palms and shout your Hosanna. Christ is risen, chippies. Don't forget that, right? But wow, this is really this parade is really contextualized in very, very difficult language. So whatever the people are thinking, it's very courageous of them to do this. This is not just having a good time. This is daring stuff. It's a lot easier for us to do it. Nobody's going to come in here and tear us down. But this is a difficult context. Okay. I think I have shot my wad here. You all have any better insights? Any correction? Looking over my notes to see if I forgot anything of great interest. Betty wants to remind us, on unbroken horses, generally you have to work really hard to get those horses used to the stuff on the path in their way. They tend to get freaked out at a tarp on the ground. Foals avoid steps and logs, and same with unfamiliar sounds. So this kind of sounds like magic, Jesus. Being able to ride on an unbroken colt with all this noise and all these distractions. And it doesn't say they tripped and fell. So maybe there is something. Maybe I need to worry about my language of magic Jesus. Maybe there is something special about it. Yes, Beryl.
Somewhere a long time ago, I think I read something about it. If you're the first to ride a horse, it's a sign of purity or nobility or something. That there is something to that. It's represented by being the first rider, but I can't and I don't remember it clearly.
So this is actually a reference, an echo of Zephaniah that says, "Behold, your king comes to you riding on a colt, the foal of an ass." And it's kind of we think that's a repetition, a colt, which is a foal of an ass. Matthew reads it as two animals, and he has Jesus on two animals in some respect. I don't know how to envision that.
Right.
And with Zephaniah, you have to go back to the whole chapter around that. I think it's the second chapter of Zephaniah. That it becomes a sign of humility, I think, in Zephaniah. Yeah. But I haven't researched that lately, and I'm not recalling it very well right now.
Well, Luke is writing this after everything has happened.
Right,
So
temple
he wants to
destroyed by the
portray
time.
this in
Yeah.
a significant manner.
Right. Yeah, and if nothing else, maybe we could read it in that respect, that around 85 of the Common Era. So around, we like to think maybe 50 years after the death of Jesus, 40 to 50 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. Luke is actually writing the story, so it's been passed down in oral tradition now for 40 some years. And if that's the case, yes, the temple's been destroyed. Not one stone left upon another, so to speak. Radically destroyed and emptied out. And Rome has built frescoes of the general Tiberius taking the ornamentation from the temple back to Rome. That's kind of an in-your-face, who's your daddy sort of thing that Rome would do often. And yeah, all of that's history. And in that respect, this could be Luke's way of saying, listen, we had our moment. And if you're wondering whose fault it is that the temple is destroyed, the temple, you had your moment. You had your opportunity. And I think for Luke, especially, I don't know if Matthew would go there, but Luke would say, so the reign of God is much bigger than you ever thought, because now it's spreading out. That's why we have the book of Acts. Okay? All right, we're going to leave it right there. And it's been my honor to just confuse everybody more than before. Sue Ann, if you're listening, you can stop the recording at this time. And thank you for those of you who joined us online. Thank you.